Hello everyone, it's Mecha here, and welcome to this tier list of the Fire Emblem Engage Emblem Rings. I'll be ranking the emblems based on how useful I think they are, based on my own experience and some of what I've heard from other people. This experience is a single hard mode playthrough, a little bit of normal mode, a little bit of maddening, but those are only the early game really. That might sound a little bit vague and like I'm going over all the difficulties at once. That can't be very accurate, right? But it's just supposed to reflect my opinions right now, and maybe later we'll look back on it and think, wow, Mecha, you were so adorable and naive and uninformed back then, and we can all point and laugh. Now, unlike with units, emblems aren't really optional. You generally don't bench an emblem ring. You're going to bring all that you have. Unless you have the DLC, then you'll have more emblems than you have units deployed. But I don't have the DLC, so I won't be tiering those. So with units, you can only deploy and train so many. If I don't bring Amelia to a chapter, I can bring Kyle instead. If I don't spend XP on Florina, I can train Raven more. There's an opportunity cost. But with emblems, the question we're asking isn't really what's the opportunity cost of using this emblem. It's more how much do they impact your playthrough. So what I'm going to be trying to do is a thought experiment. Not answering whether you're going to use them, but how much worse off would you be if you didn't use them? How much do these emblems really do for you when you actually have them on the field? Sometimes I have an emblem on the field, I feel like, well, I could have just not brought them. It didn't really make a very big difference, which is usually a sign that I'm using them wrong. Because as you can see on the tier list, I have 3 tiers: S for broken, A for good, and B for nice. There's no C, D, E, or F tier. I think all the emblems are good and helpful in some way. And spoilers, the DLC ones, the same goes for those pretty much. They're all really, really good. Arguably even better. So none of them are bad, but some of them are better than ours. So that's, I think, where the fun of ranking things comes in, is how good are they relative to each other. Now, I don't have everything on this game memorized, but I do have OifiBot here to help me out with that, so let me get them on the screen. I have some stats on the screen, right? That might be helpful as a reminder. But yeah, I'm not the expert on this game. I just played it a little bit. I've played a playthrough. So let's just rank the emblems, right? That's what we came here for. So let's go into Marth. Marth is around for the early game the most, and then he's around for late game the least. I'll just wait a little bit on getting all spoilery for later characters, but you'll have our Emblem Marth for the least amount of time in the late game. And that's kind of annoying for his ranking, because it means he's mostly going to be based on his early game utility, and in the late game I didn't really use him all that much. The early game Marth, I think it's fair to say he is all about 2 things, is the offensive power that he adds, divine speed and extra attack at 50% damage in combat is very good. Adds some durability to Alir as well if you use him on him, because he has some kind of soul attack when you use that extra attack, but generally it's about the offense increase. His stats are also very offensively based. If you can see at his stats, top right, Oifi, he mostly boosts your strength, your dexterity, and your speed, all of which are very useful, even in dexterity, but the most focus is going to be on strength and speed probably. Rapier is nice because it adds some effective damage, but I think the main source for Marth, the reason why you want to use him when it comes to emblem weapons, is Mercurius. Doubling your XP gain and effectively also doubling your SP gain is massive, depending on what difficulty you're playing on. I found it most impactful on maddening mode and to a lesser extent hard mode, because there you're going to be short on XP, whereas when I'm playing normal mode, I had no difficulty getting anyone to a high level without Mercurius even. Like, people hit level 10 pretty easily. Hit 1000 SP early for getting Cantor if they wanted to before chapter 10 hits. So in that sense, I think Mercurius is mostly relevant for higher difficulties, but it is really nice to just have an XP, machine on one of your units. But how useful it is exactly depends on the context. Everything else, I mean, there's some avoid skills in there that are nice. I think probably more relevant for inheritance than anything else. The avoid plus 10 skills. Those are funny. Lodestar Rush, I think it's a nice delete button. One thing I didn't really do very much in my first playthrough that I probably should have done more often with Lodestar Rush is use a high might weapon with it. Putting like a blade on a character and having them just massacre an entire health bar, because the main drawback of the blade weapons is that you have an insane amount of weight. You would attack before the enemy. You get attacked by the enemy before they get a chance to counter. But none of those drawbacks really apply when we're using an engaged attack, because the enemy doesn't get to counter in the first place. So this is a good way to just delete an entire health bar with Lodestar Rush. So in that sense, Marth is very, very good early on. Late game, I think you're generally going to have a harder time justifying using Marth themselves. What I personally found is that, there's this other mechanic in the late game that kind of overrides a unit. They still need an Emblem Ring on them. but you don't necessarily want to use Marth anymore. I say not necessarily because there are other emblems you could use to replace that. I'm being purposely vague here, by the way, because it's early in the video. I don't want to spoil too heavily. But yeah, I didn't use Marth that much in late game. Obviously, some of these tools are still helpful, but for example, the Falchion I don't think is massively impactful. There's like 1 or 2 instances where it's very good, but the main draw of those kind of weapons, like Falchion, is like Wyvern effectiveness or Dragon effectiveness. Except most of the worms you find in the game are corrupted worms, which do not take effective damage from weapons like the Falchion unless you have this other thing added to it, which you don't always do. So that means Marth is mostly impactful in the early game, like I said, but not super impactful late game, which means he can't really be S. You could argue him to be A, but I think he's going to end up being nice, and maybe we'll move him around a little bit based on that. Next up, we got Celica. And Celica, let me move down a little bit in Oifi so we can see her things too. So Celica, you get her very early as well. And I think she is mostly about Warp Ragnarok for me. That's at least the most spectacular thing about her. You can put her on anyone, and at one point in the map they could just move over and nuke something with Warp Ragnarok. Obviously, best used on a mage character, such as Selene or Citrine or Clan if you're using him. People like that because they'll probably do more damage with Warp Ragnarok. I have used her on some funny other units, like I've tried her on Louise for one map for funnies just to get him caught up. But generally you want to use a magic attacker with her because she does boost magic a lot. She has magic +5 at the highest level, but even before that, the emphasis is on magic. A little bit of strength too, like you can use swords with her, but I think the main emphasis is on magic-based attacks. I say magic-based because tomes are not the only thing she's good at. You can also use 11 sword with her and get some mileage out of it. I think that doesn't work with Resonance, which adds some damage at the cost of some HP. But I think that is only when you use tomes. I'm not going to check Oifi right now because it'll mess up my overlay. But I do believe that's how it works. I just streamed the game last night and had this exact interaction. So yeah, those are nice. Recover I don't find super impactful, but Seraphim was very nice early on. There's a couple chapters where you're fighting Corrupted. So that's a nice engaged weapon to have. Echo I'm finding more and more interesting. Echo is one of those things where when you read it at first, it doesn't seem like it adds a whole lot. Like you're attacking twice at 50% damage. That comes down to the same thing. But the point of Echo is to use mechanics that boost your damage output based on how many battles you do rather than how much damage you're doing strictly. For example, chain attacks. If you have a couple of backup units next to other units, you can use Echo and get a bunch of free train attacks in. Obviously really good with the strategy where you're using a bunch of heroes or other backup units with like dual assists, inherited from Lucina, to just get a massive amount of chain attacks. That strategy is very funny. I'm not sure how viable it is to clear like cheese difficulties with it, but if that's something you're doing, then Echo is definitely something you want to keep in mind. Of course, Celica has a lot of room for experimentation with extra bonuses depending on your subclass, so like Dragon, Covert, Mystical, Cavalry, Flying, etc. A lot of these I haven't had the time to experiment with, but that's the reason why I'm doing a normal mode playthrough and why I'm doing a maddening playthrough by my own, is to experiment with these kind of things. For example, I've been throwing Celica on Mage Knight Anna for a little bit with the extra Warp Ragnarok distance. We'll see how much that impacts my playthrough. I think the main draw is the Mystical. The main class you want to use it on is the Mystical because plus 20% damage is quite a boost. But there's a lot of different ways you can make use of Warp Ragnarok. The main one I find is just catching up after you've diverted a little bit, or getting an early jump on enemies, or something like saving Louise and Chloe by using Selene to warp to there. Those kind of things. It's pretty straightforward. But Celica is a little bit underexplored for me. I haven't had the chance to use her a lot, also because she's also takes a while to come back after you lose her, or her ability to use her. So generally you can use it in the early game, and the early game has a pretty restrictive way of using units. You don't get many second seals, you don't get many master seals, and you only have a couple mages that can use her, and no one else really wants to use her all that much. So I don't find Celica super versatile. One funny thing I do like to do with Celica before we move on to Sigurd is throw her on Yunaka, and then have Yunaka teleport to a terrain tile, and then she can be like in the middle of like a bunch of enemies and not get hit. Of course, these kind of strategies do depend on difficulty. This worked very well for me on normal and hard mode, but if you're playing on Manning, then the enemies will just ignore her if they have 0 hit. If they don't have 0 hit, they will attack her. So depending on engraves and weapon weights and whatever kind of boost you stack on her, it might still work or it might not. Your mileage may vary. I think Celica's alright. I do think late game, these tools are less handy. Warp Ragnarok particularly, A little bit less relevant when you have warp staffs to go around and rescue and rewarp, and Micaiah Emblem especially kind of replaces that kind of utility. It doesn't mean it's bad to have more of it, but it feels less necessary. Seedall and also having the option to put counter on even more units, that kind of stuff, it kind of makes Warp Ragnarok less special. It's still useful. It also helps that in the early game you can OHKO enemies with Warp Ragnarok, where I feel like in the late game that doesn't happen as much. But again, I have yet to experiment a whole lot with it. Overall, I would say Celica's around Marth's level of usefulness. It seems like I'm kind of giving them a hard time by putting them in the lowest tier, but they're still useful, right? They're still B tier. I just don't think they're broken. Although you can argue that in the early game, they're more towards the S and A. I just try to take into account the late game as well. Now, Sigurd has a lot of mobility. In fact, let me use Moifi to show just how much. The amount of mobility that Sigurd provides is so insane. He adds about as much movement to a unit with Gallop as they already have in the first place. Because in the early game, basically everyone has 4 move, or 5 if they're a Cavalier or something. It's quite insane. And then if they're Cavalry, or if they're a Dragon, he adds even more. If they're covert units, they don't even pay movement cost on terrain, so you can use like ETA to just zoom around the map and ignore forests. That stuff is really funny. And then Override is of course very spectacular. Just have like a long line of enemies that you can just like bull rush through and mash them all to pieces in between. Funny to combo with the Rider's Bane if there's any Cavaliers in there, because you can just OHKO Cavaliers while hitting them all. Bunch of little fun combos with that. The Brave Lance on Sigurd, I've put it on some units in the early game because I kind of forgot about it in my first playthrough. Didn't find it all that good. It had some accuracy issues. I threw him on Louise, a pretty popular and straightforward combo. Louise is an armor knight with so much defense that a lot of enemies on Manning will even ignore him. Sigurd adds even more defense, by the way, so it compounds a lot. And then the thing with Louise is, even though enemies will ignore him on Maddening, he can still just kind of play riskily and go forward a lot, which combines well with Sigurd. Like, if the only limitation to how far you can move is your movement stat, you want to put Sigurd on them. Whereas, if they're a more fragile unit, they can still use the mobility well to attack and canter away, but there's not much else they can do with that. I think he's best used on a use that's like really durable by themselves, and then can make use of his offensive tools every now and then. But that's how I generally would use Sigurd. I mean, Sigurd Louise is a pretty well-known and straightforward combo in the early game. I do think later on you'll want to use different units than Louise. But mobility never really falls off. Mobility is always useful, I think. Turfing, not as useful. You could honestly not do the Sigurd Paralog and come out fine, but the Sigurd Paralog is very easy to cheese, so I see no reason to skip it per se. You probably want to get the rewards for it, even if they're small. The main thing with Sigurd is probably, for other units that don't use Sigurd themselves, is inheriting Canter. I'm not going to get too much into that. I'm not going to give him credit for Canter being good to inherit, because in the end, you don't really need the Sigurd ring in battle to use Canter. You just need to inherit it. Think of it as more of a Somnium mechanic that happens to be available when Sigurd is. But I'm not going to give units credit for their skills being good to inherit. Rather, what I want to give units credit for is when their toolkit from their Emblem Ring combines well with other inherited skills. For example, I don't know, getting Vantage from Leaf, or getting Resolve from Ike, stuff like that. With that said, I think Sigurd is very, 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 very good to put on anyone. Like, basically anyone you use becomes super useful in the early game, just because they're able to be so flexible with where they attack from, where they go. Besides Louise, it's very nice on Chloe as well. Makes good use of Lance Power and Momentum as well. Momentum just adds so much damage, I find. I know it's only one hit and only on player phase, but if you're able to just go from one side of the map to the other and use Momentum, that's still like a boost of, I don't know, like 10, 15 damage sometimes. That's very significant still. So I do think it's worth mentioning at the very least. So I think Sigurd is an S tier emblem unit. Oh, pro tip, click the left button to show more characters. How about no? Let me get rid of that. Alright, we're like 14, 15 minutes in. It's probably now a good time to ask, why the hell is Samyam here? This is a funny thing. I talked about this on stream the other day. Some people don't watch videos to the end, and I'm like, oh, that's sad. I wish people watch videos to the end. But now, if someone asks, hey, why is Sami here? I'll know they haven't watched up to this point, because Sami is just here to see if people watch up to this point. So if you're still watching, good on you. You're a pro. If I had to tier Sami, he'd obviously be S tier, but he's really just a separator here between the early game emblems and the mid game emblems. That's really why I'm here. Depending on how long this video goes, I'll probably stop after Roy and then do the other ones later, because honestly I need more videos, and also I need some more time to use these characters or these emblems more now that I know more about the game. So this is just a video I'm making right now based on the early game emblems. There you go, that's what Sami is for. It's a nice stopping point and a test to see if you're watching all the way through. Anyway, let's continue on with Micaiah. So Micaiah, I think, I'm just going to spoil it right now, Micaiah is a candidate for the best emblem in the game, and I think a lot of people agree with that. I've seen her high on other people's emblem tier lists, and I can really see why, because I think the main reason for that is the staff range and AoE effect when she is engaged. Augment. Having 5 extra range on staves, I mean, that's good. It just turns everything into like a physic range. You know, that's nice. But an area of effect +1 means that she can heal multiple people, she can warp multiple people, she can rewarp multiple people, she can rescue multiple people, she can freeze multiple enemies at once if you want to. You can restore people from if they're being statused all at once, if you didn't manage to freeze all the enemy free staff users at once. Silence multiple people. It goes on and on. This is a very strong effect that I don't think we've seen a whole lot in past Fire Emblem games, not even in like Kaga Saga games as far as I know. It's so powerful, and it's available from the start. It's so stupid. Great Sacrifice. This seems like a massive heal effect, but it really is a massive XP machine, kind of like Marth with the Mercurius. People just use it to get free levels on units they want to favor a little bit. Some people like to use it on Anna or Jean to get them extra levels. Some people use it to snowball other units out of control. I don't know, maybe a Lear, maybe Chloe, stuff like that. It's useful for that, so try to get a lot of people hurt and use Great Sacrifice to heal people. This is the funny bit. If you're an armored unit using Great Sacrifice, you rally defense +1 to all people you heal. But apparently it also works on full heal people, so you just like use it turn 1 and get a free level up for no reason. A very funny bug that I enjoy. The rest of them, not super useful covert effects on Great Sacrifice. Nosferatu is another highlight of Micaiah's I find, that I didn't really use very well until I got her back and realized, oh, I could just put Nosferatu on Ivy, and then if Ivy doubles, which doesn't happen all the time, but I could make it happen at least with some favoritism, and then Ivy could just like face tank a bunch of enemies and kill them, whereas before, for me, Ivy was this kind of tank-ish unit that had very low luck and had trouble doubling and couldn't take enough hits to be worthwhile frontlining with. But with Nosferatu, that last problem kind of vanished, and that made her from okay to really busted and good. So that's why I find Nosferatu is super nice to have. It is pretty low might. I don't remember exactly how much it has, but I do remember it's lower than most tomes you can use. So if you want to one-run an enemy, sometimes you still have to switch to something else, but that is possible. The other tomes I don't find nearly as useful, but sometimes they're relevant, like Shine, to light the Fog of War chapter in Yunaka map. That's nice, I guess. But other than that, it doesn't really do a whole lot for her. And Thani, I mean, you kill horse and, you know, armored units sometimes, but generally, I'm all about Nosferatu tanking. And the thing with engaged weapons is you cannot trade them to the top of a unit's inventory after they've acted. You can't really interact with them with any way with trading. So if you use like one of the other ones on player phase, or even if you use like a tome you had in your inventory, you can't really switch to Nosferatu. So I find that you have to dedicate to Nosferatu a little bit. Or, you know, attack with one of them, then dance her maybe with Seedal or your Byleth Dance. That's like an option. Our stat bonuses are mostly based on magic and res and luck. I think only the magic is really relevant. Or like the most relevant part of this. Silence Ward, I think is kind of whatever. Cleric Plus, I also didn't find super relevant. Healing Light, like none of these are super great. I know what they do individually, just not which does which, and I found none of them super relevant, personally. But that's probably because I haven't played with enough with it, and probably because I'm just placing so much emphasis on augments. Augment is the bread and butter here. So I'm gonna put Micaiah over Sigurd. I think she's insanely good. And the only reason you don't think she's the best is because you value mobility more, or you value speed taker more, or you value bulk more than the goddess. Which is possible, but I think Micaiah is the best right now. At least I think she'll end up on top at the end of this video right now. So let's move on to Leaf. So Leaf, pretty interesting emblem. One of my favorite lords personally, because I love Thracia 7076, but Leaf got done a little bit dirty in this game. Leaf is not the greatest emblem of all time, to say the least. He does still have his uses though, and I think as we play more and more, we'll probably find that the most important, the best things you can do with Leaf, and he won't rank a whole lot higher than he does right now, but people at least will probably get over the notion that he's terrible, because he's not a liability, he's fine. But it does kind of depend on what you do with him, I find. So the main thing about Leaf is weapon triangle control with adaptable. If foe initiates combat, unit counters with the best weapons available in terms of range, weapon advantage, effective bonus, etc. Apparently it's been figured out exactly how this works. Shoutouts to Raisins for alerting me to that. I don't have it memorized quite, but I do believe it's basically making sure you can counter and then doing as much damage as possible in one hit. And then if that doesn't work out, then it adds up all the weapon stats, and whichever has the highest total is picked, which is why Master Lance ends up being on top sometimes, to people's detriment, because the Master Lance will often weigh a unit down and maybe get them killed. And of course, Master Lance also counters a lot, so that also changes that. Or you can end up equipping the Light Brand, and then suddenly you're dealing magic-based damage, which might also be a disadvantage. This is why people generally don't like Leaf, because he's supposed to be an enemy phase optimizer, but then he picks the wrong weapon sometimes, because the AI is not the best at picking your weapons. Some of the details I've just said were probably not entirely accurate, but this, I think, roughly mirrors the experience people have with Leaf. That's what I want to get across. So what you can do to kind of cheese around that is not boost your bond with Leaf, or not have a bond combo to the point where you can equip the Master Lance or a Light Brand, and instead just stick to the Killer Axe, and then whenever he's attacked from range, you can probably equip like your own whatever you want. Maybe you do want the 11 sword, or maybe you do want a hand axe, I don't know, something like that. You can optimize it yourself, but the point is Leaf won't pick the Master Lance for you, and that's the most important part. Of course, there's like all sorts of subclass bonuses that I won't read out for you. You can see them on screen, but I haven't been able to experiment too much with them. I mostly put Leaf on backup units, which means plus tank rate, which is kind of whatever. Quadruple hit is another bit of a meme, where he attacks once with a sword, lance, axe, and bow. I don't recall exactly which they were, just that you often see like Leaf doing very unimpressive damage depending on what you target. What really made a difference for me with quadruple hit is I had Leaf on Kagetsu as a wyvern for a little bit, and what really started making him do more damage is throwing momentum on him. Because apparently it applies to all 4 the quadruple hits, and so you suddenly add like 10 damage to each hit, and that really makes a big difference. But it really depends on what you target with it. I guess it's partially being hated on because people try to use it to kill bosses, and then the attack power you have is not sufficient to really do a lot of damage to bosses. But that's what that's just my guess here. But generally people find Leaf very underwhelming. Like I've seen a meme on Twitter where someone's like, oh, I love all the Emblem Rings. They have like a list of all the emblems, except they substitute Leaf for the All-One S-Rank ring, which is, you know, you make Thundertone's Brave is obviously a lot easier to use than Leaf. Stat-wise, I think the most notable thing about Leaf is that he adds a lot of build. So people could throw him on someone like Tamara, or someone else who's lacking in build and just needs a little bit of speed. Obviously, like most games with Constitution or build is strictly worse than speed, in the sense that if you're not being weighed down, then speed still helps you. But if you are not being weighed down, then build doesn't help you. So it only gives you more attack speed if you're being weighed down. But some people are perpetually weighed down, and so build can help them a little bit. Vantage, I mean, it's only impactful when you're about to get killed and you want to kill the enemy before you kill them, or maybe you have some kind of healing effect, but you can use it to that effect. I've seen Vantage builds on, for example, Tamara, or not Tamara, well, maybe Tamara too, but I was thinking of Panette. You know, crit enemies before they can even hit you. Of course, it's hard to crit enemies with a 2-range weapon. You can't really build reliable crit on that. You kind of need the Killer Axe, but that is one way to go about it. Arm shields I also find quite funny. You know, adding extra, basically getting weapon triangle when you have a unit that has weapon triangle control is pretty funny. I think armored units even get extra defense if they have weapon triangle advantage, which is pretty funny. Actually, notice what arm shields does, but you know, when you're engaged and you have adaptable, you get weapon triangle advantage more often, because that's another thing that it takes into account that I forgot to mention earlier. But that can be nice because it lets you do some old school Fire Emblem where you see a lance enemy, you throw out Leaf user with an axe, and they will take much less damage. Like, it's a defense boost. Durability boosts are always nice when you can take advantage of them. So yeah, Leaf is a pretty extensive kit that I think you can make use of fairly well, but I don't blame anyone for calling him the weakest emblem right now. Alright, let's get to Roy, last one on the list for today. We'll use the other ones in some other time, some other place. Right, so the deal with Roy is, I think the level boost is what I've been using the most, and then if you're getting better at the game, then holdout becomes a lot more easy to take advantage of. My main annoyance with Roy is when he's on enemies, I can't kill them with holdout. I'm like, oh yeah, I can just wreck Marnie with a double attack, and then she has Roy on her, and she survives with 1 HP. That's my main experience with Roy. My main use of Roy has been, well, first he was on Diamond because he's forced there and for a chapter, and then I try him out on different people, but I find it hard to really make use of him. And it really came together when I realized that the strength bonus he gives by himself is massive, and then he also gets 5 level ups from Rise Above, and that means that I threw him on Marin, who was having trouble hitting 2-hit KO thresholds, and all of a sudden she was 2-hit killing people again with her silver dagger, and that was really good because Marin has 1-to range. So if you can kill a lot of enemies in one enemy phase, you don't have to take care of one player phase. More enemies being more dead is very nice. So Roy was very good for that, but there's a ton of other uses for him as well. The main one I think that I've seen is NOS tanking or using Soren, the DLC emblem, to restore HP. The idea is that if you start combat with a certain percent of HP with holdouts, depending on which level holdout we're talking, you survive combat. It's kind of like an automatically proccing miracle, if you're familiar with that. So, and then you use something like Nosferatu to heal your HP, or use the Soren emblem to heal HP. Of course, if you use Soren emblem, you have to inherit holdout, of course. But if you're using Nosferatu, then you just heal back up, and you just repeat the same process again and again until the enemy is dead, because you can never die, because holdout stops you from dying, and then but only when you're above a certain threshold, but then you make sure you're always above a certain threshold thanks to a healing effect. That's the main gist of it. It's pretty good. It's pretty broken. I like it. I haven't been able to use it yet, but I'll definitely make a build like it, either on my normal or my maddening mode playthrough. Seems pretty good. Lance Reaver, I mean, if you want to break a Lance enemy user, go right ahead. Generally, I find that around the time Roy joins is when I start breaking enemies a bit less, but there are certainly builds and combos where breaking is still relevant. If you're using warriors, adding 5 damage whenever an enemy is broken can be a pretty big difference maker. If you're taking down a boss, that 5 damage adds up, and boss fights are a big thing in this game, especially on a casual playthrough, so I definitely don't hate the idea of taking advantage of that. So Lance Reaver can help with that. Wormslayer, same issues as other worm-slaying weapons that I mentioned before. Most of the worms you're fighting have corrupted tag, which means they're not affected by weakness like this unless you have a certain late-game thingamajig. And then Binding Blade, I mean, 1-to range is good. There's a lot of these around in the emblems. I think later on we'll see Ike as well with the Ragnell. Add some flexibility. If you have a unit that's already enemy phasing, the Binding Blade can be nice. In my case with Marin, it didn't do as much because I think the dagger, or like the whatever forged dagger I was using, was usually better. Either due to the poison or to the might difference. I forgot if they were both there or not. But that is one thing that Roy has on later levels. But yeah, the main thing that I enjoy is Rise Above, just getting a unit 5 extra fixed levels. It's just a funny mechanic that I really enjoy. Last note on Blazing Lion. I've been underutilizing this quite a bit, but I've heard from other people that's very impactful, so I'd be stupid not to mention it. Basically, it makes a massive fire area that enemies have trouble moving across, and if they're starting to turn on it, they're going to take some extra damage. This is an ability that I have trouble utilizing personally because I'm always like, damn, I don't want to hinder my own character's movements. I don't want to set my own characters on fire. And oftentimes, I'm right next to the enemy as player phase starts because, I'm trying to fight them on enemy phase. And so I don't want to set my own units on fire. I don't want to hinder my own movement. I don't want to make a move that I'm later going to end up regretting. And that's especially bad when it's also, your engage attack. So you don't want to spend your engage attack doing something that might potentially hinder you. But I've heard from other people that this is quite a good effect. I've also heard from people using fire tiles from the Corn emblem. You can do that, I think, among others, if you put them on a dragon unit. But I forgot what other type of unit does that. But the point is, fire good, apparently. And I'd be silly not to mention how good it is. I've seen one case of it being like you slow down the enemy's advances with it. Like if you have a large group of enemies in front of you, what you can do is put up a large fire with Blazing Lion, and then the next group of enemies is going to have trouble getting through it, but they'll still move closer to you, and the next turn you can just hit them. Maybe they'll walk into the fire if they're being especially silly, or you can set it up so you hit a lot of enemies currently in front of you with the fire, and then the next group of enemies can't reach you as easily. So kind of like a crowd control ability that I've been underutilizing, but I know is very good. And speaking of good, that's where I'm going to end up putting Roy, because Roy is pretty good. And otherwise the A tier would be completely empty, and that would be silly. So yeah, Sigurd and Micaiah in broken, Roy in good, and the rest of them are nice. If it looks like a weird way to distribute it, I think a lot of these will probably end up being in good or broken. And then maybe one of them could end up in nice, but honestly I could see them all being good or broken. Again, if you watched it to this point, congrats. You know why Sami is here as a separator between this video and the next, as well as a reminder that you watched all the way to the end and you're a pro. If this seems a bit hastily recorded, I'm mostly doing this because I realized I need a video to upload this weekend, because I won't have time to stream, most likely, or the energy to stream. And I was also like, well, I kind of want to get one of these out at some point, just to give my impressions, because I can only give my first impressions once, and once I've studied the game more, and I've made some more elaborate analysis, it's hard to go back and do something of like what I thought at first, but this will kind of record the memory of what I thought of everything back then. I don't expect this to change as much as the character analyses, because these are more influenced by more experienced players telling me about their experiences, which I'm very grateful for. But still, there might be like some kind of meta shift where, I don't know, like Leaf or Celica is appreciated more, or Sigurd is actually overrated, stuff like that. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.